Good morning and good afternoon to everyone. I'm delighted to be presenting here today on the first webinar, where I'll be speaking about the need for high-skilled labor in response to the COVID-19 crisis. This will allow us to look at the current situation and particularly the drivers for change as we exit the crisis. I will not focus too long on the Intra-corporate Transferee Directive, but instead quickly move on to the present situation and the future impact. The idea is to frame this whole webinar as a reaction to the COVID-19 crisis and the fact that the ongoing swift digitalisation and industrial change across Europe will require high qualified third country nationals to support industries. Just to be clear on definitions, the directive on intra-corporate transferees was adopted in 2014, and this covers employees working for a company established outside the European Union who is transferred to a branch of the same company in the European Union. And it was adopted in order to address a shortfall in labor, given the clear shortages in sectors like computer programming and engineering. So I will reference the Intra-corporate Transferee Directive and the possibilities available within this, as well as the update of the Blue Card Directive and the changes to the Posted Workers Directive too. So to explain a little bit more here as well, the Blue Card Directive, this was adopted in 2009, was designed to regulate the entry and also the residence provisions of high qualified third country workers in the EU, as well as attracting the right talent. And a revision was launched in 2016, but this still remains blocked. And I'll say a few words about that later in this presentation. And for the Posted Workers Directive, this was adopted in 1996. It was revised in 2018, and these amendments will be transposed into law by the end of July 2020. All three of these pieces of legislation will need to be leveraged in order to lift the EU economy after the corona crisis. So to begin with the Intra-corporate Transferees Directive, in my paper, I covered the full range of options that the directive allows and that the EU member states are not currently taking full advantage of in most cases. Before the corona crisis, there was a demand for high-skilled labor and positions were going unfilled. Of course, with the current closures and lockdowns across Europe, this situation has been paused, but it is not something that has gone away. The reality is that high-skilled migration and intra-corporate transferees in particular represent a clear and distinct category of workers who provide services and skills which cannot be found locally, come for a limited amount of time, somewhere between 90 days and 3 years with extensions, and also on relatively high salaries and positively contribute to their host country economically. So post-crisis, countries will need to address 5 specific things. Firstly, the issue of arbitrary quota systems, which some countries have in place. Secondly, different approval and rejection systems across Europe. Also putting in place a fast track system where there is a specific need. Fourthly, the increased intra-EU mobility. And finally, the ability to work at a customer site. By addressing these things, which I will speak to in a bit more detail shortly, business and the economy as a whole should be able to benefit. So if we move on to the next slide. So the coronavirus means that an even stronger reaction will be needed once the crisis passes to kickstart the EU economy. This leads to several possible scenarios. Scenario one is that third country nationals will be needed to provide new skills, particularly given the aging population in Europe. And I think that the corona pandemic has highlighted just how many old people there are in the European Union. Italy and France are two of the most worst affected countries. And we see the number of 80-year-olds and 90-year-olds there are in the population who have sadly died. And of course, this is an age group who are most affected by this disease. Scenario two is that the current crisis means that labor just stops moving. Over the long term, this will mean forced elements of increased automation, less migrant jobs, and this could in turn have a significant impact on the global economy. Scenario three is that we see increased inequality globally. Migrants often do the jobs which can't be done from home, and this sees them losing their positions as containment continues and can lead to discrimination too. And linked to this is a fourth scenario whereby the COVID-19 crisis has made it easier to close borders. And this is something that has public support, and I will talk about that a little bit more in a moment. And also scenario five is that global migration is pushed into more illicit, shadowy and irregular pathways as regular and safe migration methods disappear. So if we look at the next slide, we can say that counterintuitively, though, while the need for migration and third country nationals is rising over the long term, the desire to accept this is falling. And this is something, of course, that was happening before the corona crisis set in. But why is this the case? Well, the European Union amended its approach to both legal and illegal migration in response to the migration crisis of 2015. This was marked by high numbers of refugees arriving in the European Union via Southeast Europe and across the Mediterranean Sea. Although the arrivals have now fallen over the intervening years, the effects are still being felt in national policies, but also the rhetoric and the views of politicians and public opinion across much of the European Union. This is a trend that is likely to remain for some time. We've been seeing on the Greek-Turkish border, we're seeing the brutality and the tone towards migration has changed in general. In 2015, it was sympathy, it was welcoming. Now it's a mood of almost keeping people out at any cost. This hardline approach is affecting legal and high-skilled migration as much as illegal migration. The corona crisis has heightened this. Borders are closing and the single market is in some cases being undermined too. And politicians are looking for local solutions, and the current policy and rhetoric centers around protecting local workers. And amid these mass layoffs, there is less appetite for migration, perhaps understandably. And sadly, though, irregular, legal, and high-skilled workers are all mixed in together. And since there are no reliable figures on high-skilled migration in a lot of places, and the scaremongering affects everyone, just having separate statistics on high-skilled migration would be a step forward in a lot of cases. And populism, of course, was rising before the corona crisis on the back of labor market instability and concerns about jobs. But sadly, the migrants stealing our jobs line has proved to be a vote winner in many countries across the European Union. At the same time, there is a risk that the EU will promote reshoring of industry and workers, as well as the concept of EU sovereignty and protectionism more broadly. These are themes which will run through the new EU industrial strategy, which was adopted in mid-March. And this could result in borders being closed for longer, with money and focus being placed on propping up existing and perhaps inefficient European industries. The effects would be negative for the EU economy and beyond as a result. And in parallel, business is reluctant to tell its story and address some of the myths that are being spread in some cases. But there needs to be a reality check that skills can't be found locally or nationally, and that high skilled labor creates and spends more money in the local economy. It therefore benefits everyone, and this message needs to be heard. To take the example of Germany, and in the study, in the briefing, the German Federation of Industries highlighted that studies had shown that over 70% of enterprises were saying it was difficult to find suitable workers to fill vacancies. And this shortage of skilled workers is therefore jeopardizing growth for companies in a number of European Union member states. So welcoming this skilled foreign labor is one of the remedies that has been cited by various business representative bodies. So if we just change the slide here, the corona effect has been really that politically has become difficult to promote the case for intra-corporate transferees right now. And the rhetoric focuses on national solutions, closing borders, and protecting local companies and local people. That said, the relaunch and the rebound will likely come soon. And we see that the European Commission is already underlining the sectors from technology to healthcare, food production, which rely on migrants. So once the current crisis passes, the European Union will need to get back to work and move quickly. And we're already seeing that, China already opening up, for example. We're already seeing that ramping up of activities. High-skilled workers will have an important to play, and the Intra-corporate Transferee Directive will need to be fully utilized to make this happen. So let me go into a little bit more detail on how this could be done as we change slides and look at a few of the potential remedies that need to be looked at. Firstly, taking away national quotas for the number of intra-corporate transferees, as I mentioned before. This will sort of stop the limiting of the numbers. This will be a good move. The number of intra-corporate transferees should be linked to the need and not administrative quotas. The removal of quotas would also require European Union member states to have a good understanding of their labour market needs. This will also require an open relationship to be established between companies, employers, their trade associations, policymakers, and government agencies. There's no use countries allowing in huge numbers of one particular sector if there's already an oversupply locally. And the European Union has to attract the right set of talents and skills and enable emissions to be in line with employment needs. In this way, overall EU economic growth will be facilitated, and economic and social problems, as well as negative headlines, potentially avoided. And secondly, the national authorities across the European Union should be instructed to allow administrative errors to be corrected by applicants and not just reject them immediately. These errors can cover changes to submissions, the provisions of additional information where applications are incomplete. And this represents a new approach and requires an agreement and decision from national ministries and politicians. If not, national authority employees dealing with cases will interpret the letter of the law narrowly. It's not the role of these national migration authorities to facilitate economic growth, but to keep people out who do not meet the criteria set. So given this reality, clear political guidance is crucial. All too often, currently, high-skilled employees from third countries whose skills are in demand are deported for small administrative errors on their applications. And the need for talent post-corona should bring this into focus and therefore change the mindset. Furthermore, an appropriate timeline for this submission and treatment of new data would be 90 days, which is put out as good best practice. And in parallel, raising awareness of the intra-corporate transferee rules among employees and employers is a vital step which should not be forgotten. This needs to be done in a clear and obvious way and should include information sessions, it could be social media campaigns, and outreach to trade bodies too. Spreading practical information and establishing a dialogue will remove many of the most common small unintentional errors, and better collaboration between companies, large and small, trade associations, unions, and politicians will lead to better implementation of current laws, as well as support in forming, implementing, and also amending future policy, rules, and regulations. And linked to this administrative issue, all EU member states should put in place a fast-track system, many have already done so, for frequent and trusted users of intra-corporate transferees. This would mean that authorities could issue the status more quickly and not need to take each application in turn on its own merits. And this would free up time and resources for case handlers. When it comes to intra-corporate, intra-EU mobility, this should be allowed across all European member states. Countries are losing out economically by not allowing this. And even though it is covered and permitted by the current provisions and scope of the European legislation, but the need to kickstart economies after the corona crisis will force the hand of decision makers. Moreover, the notification and registration process for intra-corporate transferees moving within the EU should be administratively light process and a standard EU form agreed upon. This would make the process easier for intra-corporate transferees, companies, and also relevant national bodies, as well as speeding up the process. Concerning the possibility of intra-corporate transferees working at a client site, this should be allowed across all European member states. The nature of business today and the integrated way that companies work demands this. As such, there is clearly a joint project underway between an intra-corporate transferees employer and another company or set of companies with a contract in place. An intra-corporate transferee being based at a client's site should be permitted under these rules. So this is a bit of an overview of the areas where the intra-corporate transferee directive can be used to help the EU economy, and hopefully the need to get the EU economy going after the current crisis will be a catalyst for this. So if we move on to the next slide, we can look a little bit about the blue card scheme, because this will also potentially be a useful tool. It was launched back in 2009, but has not been very successful so far. In 2017, for example, the number of high-skilled workers coming to the EU was less than 40,000. And of this, around 24,000 were blue cards, and the majority of which were into Germany. Both workers and also companies seem to have found it of limited use over the intervening years. But a revision was launched in 2016, and discussions have been blocked. And perhaps the post-corona crisis and the need will force EU member states to unlock the blue card discussions. More ambitious reforms are needed to the blue card directive, and these include looking at reducing the cost of the blue card scheme for employers, beneficiary migrant workers, and also implementing states. SMEs, so small and medium-sized industries in particular, have turned off by the high cost of the scheme. Also, the inclusion of more skills covered by the scheme would be helpful, as would better recognition of professional experience in a number of sectors. Another potential area to look at would be offering better family reunification possibilities, and in addition, providing real additional rights and added value to protect beneficiaries would make the scheme more attractive. One obvious advantage would be for the blue card to allow access to the whole EU labour market and not just to the member state where it is granted. So an umbrella permit for the whole European Union would be something that perhaps could be looked at. And if we move slides, we can also start to look a little bit at the Posted Workers Directive, which could be used and could be a facilitation for getting the high-skilled labour into the European Union, which is required. Now, the Posted Workers Directive covers employees who are sent to carry out a service in another EU member state on a temporary basis, so different from mobile EU workers. And when it comes to third country nationals, it should be underlined once again that this intra-EU movement is based on the basis of the free movement of services, not labour. So can result in the third country nationals having fewer rights than if they were viewed as labour. The original directive was adopted in 1996. The revision was adopted in 2018, and now this needs to be transposed into national law by the end of July of this year. And the goal of the revision is to guarantee rights, working conditions throughout the European Union, and ensure a level playing field and avoid social dumping. The original directive, therefore, looked at rates of pay, work periods, rest periods, annual leave, and the conditions of hiring workers through temporary work agencies, for example. And the need for labour in a post-corona crisis European Union means that there is a better chance that posted workers will be treated better and be guaranteed more rights. And this, of course, links to the new provisions. So if we change slides, we can look in a little bit more detail about what those changes are. There are a number of new provisions which will be brought in at the end of July this year, and this should coincide with an increased economic need, we're hoping. And these cover a variety of areas. The posted workers must receive the remuneration just prescribed by the law, and not just the minimum rates of pay, as was the case in the past. This therefore extends the obligation to cover special payments, benefits, and also allowances. There is also provisions for stronger rules to ensure that posted workers are not accommodated in undignified conditions. Also, travel, board and lodging expenses for workers away from home for professional reasons cannot be deducted from the overall pay. And when the duration of a posting exceeds 12 months, all the applicable terms and conditions of employment of the relevant member state to which the employee is posted must be applied. So, moving slides, the current crisis means that there is an impact on processing times. Timelines are currently slipping, and with less economic activity in general, this is perhaps not seen as a priority. But once this crisis passes, though, we could see the opposite trend with increased demand. Should come a push to process applications quicker, and certainly within 90 days. And with a need for increased skills, we could also see more use of the fast-track procedures, particularly in key sectors like healthcare, research, science, technology, and engineering. Again, business needs to play a role here in articulating the needs that it has. So at the moment, we're seeing kind of long-term and short-term migration being affected by the coronavirus. There is currently less of a need for labor, but we're seeing national examples. Portugal, for example, offering rights to migrants during the crisis so that they can access social security and healthcare. And this economic burden is significant, though, and perhaps there could be a reaction against this further down the line. It's really important to highlight the contribution that migrants offer host countries, particularly as we exit the crisis. And furthermore, the competition for the best talent should be heightened in the post-corona crisis period. At the local level, cities even should do more to welcome third country talent which they will need and which will drive them forwards. And a good example of this would be the International House Helsinki in Finland. This is a body which provides a wide range of information and public authority services to meet the needs of international newcomers to Helsinki. And these cover registration, tax matters, social security issues, all in one place, all under one roof. And the International House Helsinki also offers a free advisory and counseling services to employers on issues related to recruiting and maintaining an international workforce. And many other cities are looking at the International House model and making plans to replicate it. This is a great example and one that could help in the search for attracting and also retaining the best talent. So if I can move to the slide on conclusions, the coronavirus pandemic has turned the world upside down, and we're feeling this really at the moment. And the short-term effect is that decision-making slows down with politicians and decision-makers focused elsewhere. We're also seeing EU member states seeking national rather than EU-wide solutions to problems. But the result is kind of closed borders, damaging bottlenecks, and a further shift towards physical trade and industrial protectionism. COVID-19 has accelerated and intensified an existing trend, while the internal market is being undermined in certain cases. But this won't last forever. The underlying need for migrant labor will not disappear. A need to kickstart the EU economy will make them more important than perhaps ever before. There will be calls for EU sovereignty and protectionism from certain quarters, certain organizations, and certain companies. But the size of the economic challenge will likely make the need for high-skilled labor and third country nationals inevitable. So despite the current lockdown and the doom and gloom in Europe and globally, the possibilities offered by intra-corporate transferees, also by the Blue Card scheme and the revised Posted Workers Directive, will all need to be exploited. Skills will need to be matched to market needs, and data will be needed to underline this requirement. This should also result, hopefully, in more rights and also more benefits for third country nationals and migrant labor more generally. So thank you very much indeed for taking the time to listen to the webinar today. I really want to hear from all of you on the questions that you have, any points that you want to make, any examples that you want to share. This would be fantastic to hear them.